Frankie Avalon, the name that once made millions of American girls scream like they'd lost their minds, lived much of his life inside an invisible cage. He was praised as the safest idol in rock and roll, handsome, gentle, spotless, the kind of star who made parents breathe easy and the press treat him kindly. But what few people understood was that safety was not a gift. It was a silent contract, forcing Frankie to remain the perfect version of himself forever. He had real talent. From a trumpet prodigy as a boy to a breakout pop star with Venus topping the charts, Frankie earned his success. Yet the moment he reached the summit, he began to grasp a cruel truth. Fame doesn't love the real person, it loves the image. Once sealed into the mold of a teen idol, every smile, every word, every step is watched. Exhaustion must be hidden. Confusion must be swallowed. Mistakes are simply not allowed to exist. Frankie's tragedy wasn't a loud public downfall. It was a decades-long battle not to be forgotten. When pop music was swallowed by the next era, he dove into beach films, then later reinvented himself through Grease. Every comeback required tearing himself away from the past. To understand how Frankie Avalon survived so many layers of fame, you have to go back to where it all began, not on a grand stage, but inside an ordinary home in South Philadelphia, born September 18, 1940, as Francis Thomas Avalon. Frankie grew up in a working-class Italian immigrant family where discipline and dignity came before open affection. His father placed a trumpet in his hands not to create a star, but because music was one of the few ways a child could escape a predetermined fate. Frankie practiced obsessively, sometimes for hours every day, until breath and sound felt welded together. That discipline turned him into a local prodigy, performing in clubs, theaters, and talent shows, and returning again and again as if stopping would make everything collapse. At just 11 years old, Frankie appeared on national television. On the Jackie Gleason show, it looked dazzling, but it was also the first sign of a life pushed into the spotlight too early. People didn't just see talent, they saw something that could be sold. From that moment, Frankie's path no longer belonged entirely to him. He continued playing trumpet in smoke-filled clubs, growing up fast, not through rebellion, but through understanding that if he wasn't exceptional, life would pull him back to where it believed he belonged. A private party connected to singer Al Martino changed everything. Frankie performed and caught the attention of the industry. I didn't just have technique, he had what the market craved. A clean-cut face, gentle features, and a presence that reassured parents while captivating teenage girls. As America searched for a safe version of rock and roll, Frankie fit the mold perfectly, while still playing trumpet for a band. Talent scout Bob Marcucci asked Frankie if he knew anyone who could sing. Frankie suggested someone else, but Marcucci heard Frankie's own voice and recognized its commercial perfection. When Frankie signed with Chancellor Records, he didn't simply enter show business, he stepped onto an assembly line. Once American bandstands stamped him as the face of American youth. The machine demanded constant output, records, hits, appearances. An image ready for bedroom walls, by 1957 Frankie was at the center of television's idol factory. Songs like D Dinah, which Frankie himself disliked, became massive hits. That's when he learned the brutal lesson that honesty mattered less than sales. By 1958 and 1959, his life became a blur of charts, magazines, interviews, and endless appearances. And the perfect smile was exhaustion, because stopping meant replacement. Then Venus arrived in 1959 and changed everything. With its orchestration and fuller vocal power, it pushed Frankie beyond teen fluff and held the #1 spot for 5 weeks. He became the ideal idol, safe, polished, non-threatening, and that perfection tightened the cage even further. By 1960, hit after hit poured out, not as freedom, but as proof of survival. Sensing the coming shift in music, Frankie moved aggressively into film. He appeared in Guns of the Timberland and the Alamo, earning validation from Hollywood legends like John Wayne, yet the more he diversified, the lonelier it became. By 1962, with 31 singles entering Billboard, Frankie could feel youth culture changing. Safer idols were becoming obsolete. His greatest transformation came with the beach films. Beginning in 1963, Frankie and Annette Funicello became the center of a sun-soaked fantasy that captured teenage America. The films were fast, cheap, wildly profitable, and emotionally hollow for the people inside them. Frankie was rescued financially but chained creatively. Trapped in eternal youth, by 1966 he admitted he was sick of sand. The line sounded light, but it marked a crisis. As the years passed, fame cooled. Frankie didn't collapse, he endured. Through the 1970s, he performed steadily, refusing to disappear. In 1976, he remade Venus as a disco track, proving he would change rather than stand still. His most unexpected rebirth came in 1978 with Grease. As Teen Angel, Frankie carefully reshaped the role to fit his identity, turning nostalgia into power. After that, he stopped chasing youth and began controlling memory. Tours, television cameos, and Back to the Beach allowed him to reclaim and parody the image that once trapped him. Offstage, Frankie chose something radical for a teen idol: marriage. In 1963, he married Catherine K. Diebel, knowing it could damage his image. It was a deliberate choice of real life over fantasy. Together, they raised a large family, grounding Frankie through decades of change in later years. Frankie became a guardian of his name, even filing lawsuits to protect it. He turned memory into commerce, nostalgia tours, product lines, cookbooks, and food brands rooted in family tradition. Performing into his 80s, he no longer chased hits. He offered audiences something else, a doorway back to who they once were. Frankie Avalon didn't survive because he stayed perfect. He survived because he learned how to bend without disappearing, how to own his past without being crushed by it. Teen Idol fame didn't destroy him, it transformed him. And in doing so, Frankie Avalon became more than a star. He became a living memory. Still standing, still singing, still here. As time moved forward, Frankie Avalon learned that longevity in entertainment isn't about chasing relevance, but about understanding timing. He no longer needed to flood the public with appearances. One step onto a stage at the right moment carried more power than a dozen forced comebacks. When he appeared on shows like Happy Days singing as himself, the effect wasn't nostalgia alone, it was emotional compression. Decades collapsed into minutes. Viewers didn't see an aging performer. They saw the echo of their own youth standing. Calmly under studio lights, small film appearances followed, never desperate, never loud. In Troop Beverly Hills, his cameo landed like a wink shared with an audience that already understood the joke. Frankie had mastered something rare: how to let people remember him without begging to be remembered. Even his role as a Sonic drive-in spokesperson wasn't accidental. His voice and smile carried comfort, a sense of stability Americans unconsciously trusted. He wasn't selling food, he was selling reassurance. Behind the scenes, Frankie remained alert. Fame had taught him that if you don't protect your name, someone else will use it. Legal battles over branding in later years weren't fueled by ego, but by experience. He had spent a lifetime watching industries consume identities, and he refused to let his be diluted in silence. Family remained the quiet spine of his life. Away from applause, Frankie found grounding in kitchens and Sunday dinners, in the rituals that fame could never manufacture. His Italian family cookbook wasn't a side project, it was a declaration. Music gave him a career, but family gave him a place to stand when the lights dimmed. Cooking, like music, became a way to stay human. When Frankie spoke about Ricky Nelson, his voice always softened. Ricky wasn't a rival, he was a reflection. Another young man shaped too early, loved too intensely, and then left to find meaning alone. Ricky's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. Frankie understood that survival sometimes means choosing steadiness over brilliance, privacy over applause. Even in his later appearances in American Idol, Dancing with the Stars, and nostalgia stages across the country, Frankie never tried to outrun time, he stood inside it. Each performance was brief, intentional, and deeply effective. It didn't need to prove anything. His presence alone reminded people of an era when innocence was still profitable. Music didn't shout, and when romance could exist without irony. By the time he reached his 80s, Frankie Avalon wasn't measuring success by charts or ticket sales. He measured it by control over his name, his story, and the pace of his life. The boy who once belonged to the industry had become the man who owned his legacy. Frankie Avalon's story isn't about a teen idol who faded. It's about a man who learned how to survive being loved too much, too early, and too perfectly. Fame tried to freeze him in one moment, but he kept moving, quietly, intelligently, and on his own terms. And that is why, decades later, when his name appears or his voice returns for a single song, the reaction is still electric. Not because he is chasing the past, but because the past still recognizes him. If you remember Frankie Avalon whether through Venus, the beach films, Grease, or sudden smile triggered by a familiar face, then you already understand his real achievement. He didn't just live through fame. He outlived it, reshaped it, and carried it with dignity all the way to the end of the spotlight. And even after all those reinventions, Frankie Avalon never fully stepped away from the quiet weight of what his life had been. Fame leaves residue. It stays in the way people look at you, in the assumptions they make before you speak, in the way strangers believe they already know you. Frankie accepted that reality without bitterness. He understood that once you become a symbol, you never completely return to anonymity. What you can do is decide how much of yourself you give away and how much you protect. In his later years, Frankie spoke less about success and more about balance. He had seen too many peers chase relevance until it hollowed them out. He chose something different. He performed enough to stay connected, but not so much that the work owned him again. Casino stages, anniversary concerts, themed nights weren't signs of decline. They were controlled environments where the audience arrived with gratitude instead of expectation. People weren't demanding a new Frankie Avalon. They were thanking the old one for still being alive. What made these performances powerful wasn't vocal perfection, it was presence. Frankie understood that when he walked on stage, people weren't listening with their ears alone. They were listening with memory, with loss, with nostalgia for a time when life felt simpler, or at least slower. His voice became a trigger, not just for songs, but for moments people had almost forgotten they missed. Behind the curtain, life continued with its ordinary struggles. Aging isn't gentle, even for legends. Joints ache, energy fades, the body that once moved effortlessly under studio lights now demands patience. Frankie didn't romanticize that process. He faced it with practicality, humor, and acceptance. Selling products for joint pain wasn't ironic to him. It was honest. Time had finally touched him, and he refused to pretend otherwise. The public often forgets that endurance itself is a form of courage. Frankie's strength wasn't in rebellion or reinvention alone. It was in his willingness to keep going without applause, to raise children, to maintain a marriage, to show up for obligations that didn't come with standing ovations. In a business where chaos is normalized, consistency became his quiet rebellion. As decades passed, Frankie Avalon's name stopped belonging to headlines and started belonging to history. Teachers mentioned him when explaining early pop culture. Parents introduced him to their children as a bridge to their own youth. His image shifted from heartthrob to heritage. And strangely, that may have been the most freeing transformation of all. Heritage doesn't demand perfection, it allows flaws, it allows rest. When Frankie looked back, there was no single moment that defined survival. It was a series of small choices, saying yes when it kept him alive, saying no when it protected his dignity, walking away before resentment could harden, returning only when it felt right. He didn't beat the system by destroying it, he beat it by understanding it better than it understood him. In the end, Frankie Avalon wasn't trapped forever in that invisible cage. He learned where the door was. He learned when to open it, when to step back inside willingly on his own terms. That's why his story still resonates. Because it's glamorous, but because it's human. A boy turned into a product. A man who reclaimed himself, and a legend who proved that survival, when done quietly and wisely, can be the greatest success of all. And perhaps the most revealing truth about Frankie Avalon is that his life never followed the dramatic. It's arc people expect from fame stories. There was no explosive collapse, no shocking scandal that forced reinvention. The struggle was quieter, more internal, and in many ways more difficult. He had to learn how to live without the roar while still carrying the echo. For someone who wants to find an era of sound and image, silence could feel heavier than failure. As he aged, Frankie became more reflective about what fame had cost him early on. Childhood passed quickly. Adolescence barely existed. While other teenagers were discovering who they were, Frankie was already being told who he had to be. That kind of pressure leaves marks that don't always show. It creates a habit of caution, a constant self-editing that can follow a person for decades. Frankie didn't rebel against it loudly. He learned to navigate it carefully, which is why his survival looked so calm from the outside. What grounded him most was routine, family meals, rehearsals done without cameras, conversations where no one asked him to relive 1959 for the 1000th time. In those moments, he wasn't a symbol or a memory. He was just a man who had lived an unusually public life and was trying to hold on to something solid as the years moved faster. Frankie also came to accept that being remembered for one era isn't a curse if you make peace with it. He stopped trying to outrun Venus, the beach films, or Teen Angel. Instead, he reframed them as chapters, not cages. When audiences applauded, he understood they weren't trapping him in the past. We're thanking him for being part of their own story. That shift in perspective changed everything. There's a quiet dignity in how Frankie Avalon aged in public. No desperate attempts to shock. No forced reinventions that didn't fit who he was. He allowed time to reshape him naturally, trusting. That authenticity, even a gentle, old-fashioned kind, still had value. In a culture obsessed with youth, that choice was almost radical. Today, when Frankie steps on stage or appears unexpectedly on screen, the reaction is instinctive. People smile before they even realize why. That's not because of nostalgia alone. It's because Frankie represents something rare now. Kind of fame that wasn't built on outrage or reinvention, but on consistency, warmth, and emotional safety. He became familiar in the deepest sense of the word, and that may be his final legacy. Not just the songs, the films, or the chart positions, but the proof that you can survive a manufactured dream without being destroyed by it. That you can be shaped by an industry and still reclaim yourself piece by piece. Frankie Avalon didn't just endure the spotlight. He learned how to step out of it without disappearing, leaving behind not noise, but a lasting gentle glow. Even now, long after the era that created him has faded into textbooks and playlists labeled oldies, Frankie Avalon's presence carries a strange emotional gravity. It isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, steady and recognizable, like a familiar melody drifting in from another room. People don't rush toward it. They pause. And in that pause, memory does the work. What makes Frankie's story linger is that he never pretended. Fame was harmless. He also never treated it like a curse. He understood it as a force, one that can lift you, shape you, and quietly erase you if you stop paying attention. Tight attentive. Not paranoid, not bitter, just aware. That awareness is what kept him alive in an industry that routinely burns through its own icons. There were moments when he could have leaned harder into myth-making, exaggerated his struggles, dramatized his survival. He didn't. Frankie resisted, turning his life into spectacle once the machine loosened its grip. He'd already lived too many years as a symbol to want to become a caricature of one. Instead, he let his legacy breathe naturally, appearing just often enough to remind people that the story was still unfolding as the decades rolled on. Younger generations discovered him not through charts or magazines, but through parents, grandparents, reruns and clips shared online. Frankie became intergenerational without trying. A face that didn't belong to one age group, but to a feeling passed down. That kind of legacy can't be engineered. It happens only when an artist doesn't fight time, but learns how to move with it, in quieter moments, away from stages and cameras. Frankie's life narrowed to the essentials: health, family, a schedule that respected limits. The same discipline that once drove a boy to practice trumpet for hours now helped an older man know when to rest. There was no bitterness in that transition, only acceptance. The show had gone on long enough for him to understand that stepping back was not losing, it was choosing, and that choice matters, because so many who came from the same era didn't get to make it. Some were swallowed by addiction, some by irrelevance, some by the unbearable weight of expectations they never asked for. Frankie survived not because he was louder or tougher, but because he was adaptable and grounded. He knew when to hold on and when to let go. If you strip away the songs, the films, the posters, and the screams, what's left is a man who learned how to live with a past that wouldn't leave him. A man who carried youth inside him without pretending to still be young. A man who understood that fame is temporary, but character has a longer shelf life. That's why Frankie Avalon's story doesn't end with a final performance or a last appearance. It doesn't need a dramatic closing scene. His legacy lives in something quieter, the way people smile when they hear his name, the way a single song can still soften a room, the way an entire era feels suddenly close again. And in that sense, Frankie Avalon was never truly trapped by the invisible cage. He studied it, he learned its shape, and over time he turned it into a shelter he could step in and out of on his own terms, at his own pace, leaving behind not just fame but a rare example of how to survive it.